They told me I would continue. They did not tell me that continuation and survival are not the same thing, that you can persist inside 2 tons of consecrated iron for a century and still lose everything that made you worth preserving, one feeling at a time, without ever once malfunctioning. I do not remember dying. I remember the moment of it. I remember standing on the wall above Hive Calyx with my bolter raised and my brothers to either side, the heretic column below us breaking against the fortification as it had broken for 11 consecutive hours, and I remember the specific quality of the exhaustion in my legs, the way fatigue settled into the lower joints as a kind of pressure rather than a pain. And I remember thinking, in the second before it happened, that we were holding, that the wall would hold, that we had done enough. The thunder hammer caught me at the midpoint of my torso. I did not hear it coming. I heard it arriving. The crack of displaced air, the shriek of ceramite giving way, and then the sound of my own voice making a sound I could not have predicted. Not a word, not a prayer, just sound, extracted from me by the impact the way sound is extracted from a bell. I was rung. I was not broken, not yet, but I was rung, and when the ringing ended, I was lying on the parapet walkway, looking up at a sky the color of ash, and my armor's internal systems were reading critical failure across 6 structural sectors, and I was trying to remember the name of the litany of iron will, the one you speak when the body has reached its limit, because somewhere in my training it was written that the litany holds the failing flesh together by the force of belief alone. I could not remember it. I kept starting it. I could not finish it. Apothecary Sale's face appeared above me. He had come across the parapet at a run, I learned later, across 40 meters of contested ground in the middle of the ongoing assault, because it is the duty of the apothecary to reach his brothers before the enemy does. He looked at me the way a craftsman looks at a piece of damaged work, not unkindly, but with the specific gaze of assessment rather than compassion. He was calculating what could be saved. "The chapter has more use for you yet," he said. I tried to ask what he meant. I do not remember what followed. I am told that the surgical team worked on me for 4 hours in the field station at the base of the wall while the assault continued above them. I am told that my primary and secondary hearts failed twice and were restarted both times by Sale's intervention. I am told that when the battle was over and the walls still stood and the heretic column had been destroyed to the last man, Chapter Master Aldrich himself came to stand beside what remained of me and speak the continuance rite over my insensate form. I am told all of this. I did not experience any of it. What I experienced was nothing. And then the Forge Chapel. The Forge Chapel of the Adamantine Brotherhood's Fortress Monastery is a long, low room carved from the mountain's living rock, lit by lumen strips mounted at floor level so that the light rises from below rather than falling from above. It makes everything look as though it is being viewed from underwater. The workbenches, the suspended servo arms, the racks of tools arranged by function, and at the chamber's far end, the 3 maintenance alcoves, each wide enough to accept a Dreadnought chassis in standing position. The room smells of machine oil and sacred incense burned in small brass dishes mounted at intervals along the walls. That smell was the first thing I processed when I became aware of myself again. Oil and incense. The familiar smell of the Brotherhood's sacred spaces translated through a sensory apparatus that was not my own nose. I did not know yet what was wrong. Tech Marine Vaughn stood before my chassis with a scroll of parchment in his hands. He was a compact man, precise in his movements, with the subdermal mechadendrites of his order visible along the back of his neck, and the red robes of his calling layered over his power armor in the way the Adeptus Mechanicus prescribed. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the scroll. He had been speaking for some time, I understood, and was now reaching the portion of the rite of reconnection that required my participation. Vox synchronization, Vaughn said. Confirm. Vox confirmed, I said. My voice was not my voice. It was my voice, but processed through a Vox grill, filtered and given a quality of metal that my biological throat had never produced. I knew it was mine because the words were mine, because I had chosen them, because the intention behind them was the same intention I had always had when I spoke. But the sound was different. The sound was something I heard from outside myself. Pressure feeds, Vaughan said. Nominal confirmation. Pressure feeds nominal, I said. He continued through the catechism, targeting reticle, auspex array, plasma reactor temperature, hydraulic response in both primary manipulator arms. I answered each item. The answers came without difficulty. The systems were online and functional and responsive, and I could feel them the way I had once felt my own muscles, as extensions of will, as tools of intent. I could feel the weight of the chassis the way a man feels the weight of his own body, as a constant and neutral presence that you stop noticing because it is always there. But I could not feel my heartbeat. I noticed this during the third question and spent the remainder of the catechism attending to it with the portion of my attention the catechism did not require. I could feel the plasma reactor. I could feel its cycle, the draw and compression and controlled burn that powered my chassis systems, steady and rhythmic and precise. It operated at a rate that was not dissimilar to a human heartbeat, but it was not my heart. It was not something inside me. It was something I was inside of. Catechism complete, Vaughan said. Brother Corvinus, you are declared functional. The rite of reconnection is concluded. May the Omnissiah's blessing hold your frame, and the Emperor's will fill your purpose. He rolled the scroll and tucked it inside his robes. He moved to the side of my chassis and opened a panel in my chest region and made 3 adjustments with a tool I could not see, and then closed the panel again. He did not speak to me during this. He spoke to the machine, a murmured series of Binharic phrases, low and rapid, addressed to the machine spirit of the chassis, requesting its cooperation and confirming its sanctity. Then he left. I heard his footsteps on the stone floor. I heard the forge chapel's heavy door open and close. I heard the sound of the lumen strips, which produced a faint and continuous electrical hum that I had never detected before, because I had never had the sensory resolution to detect it. I stood in the forge chapel, alone, and attended to what I could perceive: incense, oil, the hum of the lumens, the plasma reactor cycling in my chest, the weight of the chassis pressing down through my feet, distributed across both soles by the hydraulic dampers in my legs. I tried to feel my pulse. I searched for it the way you search for something you know you put down somewhere, methodically, moving through the places where it should be. I searched the sensation of my chest. I searched the place where the sarcophagus housing met the chassis interior, the narrow space between what remained of my biological form and the machine that contained it. I found the reactor. I found the chassis systems. I found everything the machine was doing. I did not find myself. I stood in the forge chapel for a period of time I did not track. Then I heard the distant sound of the Brotherhood's evening litany beginning in the chapel above, the assembled voices of my battle brothers raised in the prayer chant that had marked the close of each day since before my induction into the chapter's ranks. I had heard it 10,000 times. More. I had added my voice to it 10,000 times. The sound reached me as vibration through the stone floor. My chassis sensors, designed for detecting the acoustic signature of incoming ordnance at distances of several hundred meters, resolved the litany into its component voices with a precision I had never experienced before. I could hear individual brothers. I could identify them by frequency. Chaplain Darrell's resonant baritone was unmistakable. Brother Fenn's higher register, always slightly out of alignment with the others, was equally recognizable. I could hear Brother Halen's voice, the same measured cadence he used in everything, prayer as much as warfare. I listened to the litany. I could not join it. I stood alone in the forge chapel, and I listened. The ritual was correct. The chapter was intact. My brothers were there, above me, doing what they had always done. This was still the Brotherhood. This was still the familiar world. I told myself that was enough. At the time, I believed it. I was made a warrior monk of the Adamantine Brotherhood at the age of 16 standard years, inducted through the selection trials that claimed 3 candidates before it accepted me, and I wore the Brotherhood's mark for 38 years before the wall above Hive Calyx ended the portion of my existence that could be called a life in the way most beings understand the word. 38 years is not long for a space marine. I was considered mid-career. I had served in 49 recorded engagements, received 6 commendations, and held the rank of battle brother throughout. Not a sergeant, not an officer, a rank-and-file warrior of the chapter's 6th company, which is where I wanted to be. I had never sought advancement. I had wanted only to serve well and to serve clearly, to be the kind of soldier whose presence made those beside him more capable rather than less. I believed I had achieved this. My commanders confirmed it. My brothers confirmed it by the fact of their continued trust. That self is the self I brought into the chassis. I know because I can still access it. Every memory, every preference, every conviction I held at the moment of my wounding exists in my cognitive architecture with full fidelity. I remember what I believed about service and brotherhood and the Emperor's purpose. I remember what the litany felt like when I sang it. I remember the weight of my bolter in my hands, the particular balance of it, the way I held it slightly angled to account for a minor inconsistency in my right shoulder joint that I had never had repaired because it did not affect my function and I had grown accustomed to it. I remember all of this. This is not the problem. The problem will take some time to become apparent. To me, and therefore to you. The problem does not announce itself. It moves the way the tide moves. You do not see the water rising. You look down and find yourself wet. Chaplain Darrell came to me the morning after my first night in the chassis. He stood before my frame in the forge chapel, which was still my designated resting place until my full integration protocol was completed, and he spoke the rite of perpetuation, the ceremony performed over a newly interred Dreadnought brother to confirm that the man within the machine remains a full and honored member of the Brotherhood. The rite is ancient. It was written during a period of the chapter's history when there was some doctrinal uncertainty about whether a battle brother within a Dreadnought chassis retained his full spiritual standing within the Emperor's sight. The uncertainty was resolved definitively several millennia ago. The rite persists because the Brotherhood believes that what can be spoken should be spoken, that honor given aloud is more complete than honor merely assumed. Darrell had officiated this rite before. He performed it with full gravity and full sincerity. He called the plasma reactor in my chest the Brotherhood's enduring heart. He called my chassis the Brotherhood's enduring will-made iron. He placed his hand on my hull, at the point where the sarcophagus housing met the outer plating, and spoke words that in the biological rites of the chapter were spoken over a living chest. In the Emperor's sight and the Brotherhood's remembrance, this warrior monk continues. He asked me if I received these words. I told him I received them. He asked me if I held my Brotherhood's faith. I told him I held it. He asked me if I remained Brother Corvinus of the Adamantine Brotherhood, 6th Company, Battle Brother, in honorable service, now and unto the end of service. I told him I remained all of these things. He looked at me then, with the eyes of a man who had made it his life's purpose to see into the hearts of soldiers. He was not testing me. He was not suspicious. He was satisfying himself that I was whole, and what I told him with my Auspex lenses must have satisfied him, because he nodded once and placed his hand on my chassis again in the gesture of fraternal acknowledgement and left. I wanted to genuflect. It was involuntary, or as close to involuntary as a Space Marine's actions ever get, which is to say, it was the product of 38 years of muscle memory, the same deep-rooted conditioning that made me reach for a weapon no longer on my hip or flinch from a muzzle flash that had not occurred. At the end of every formal rite in the Brotherhood's liturgy, the correct response of a battle brother is to genuflect, to lower the right knee to the stone floor in acknowledgement of the Emperor's grace. Every brother in the chamber does it. It is not commanded, it simply happens. The Dreadnought chassis is not designed to genuflect. I understood this in the moment of attempting it. The hydraulics did not have the range. The knee joint was designed for stability and forward propulsion, not for the sustained articulation of kneeling, and the weight of the chassis made the attempt not merely impractical, but structurally inadvisable. I did not fall. I arrested the movement in time, but the arrest itself was its own kind of failure. I stood upright while every instinct I had told me to kneel, and the instinct did not win, and the instinct could not win. And in the gap between what I intended and what my body could accomplish, I found something I was not prepared for. I stood in the forge chapel, in the correct posture for a dreadnought at rest, alone in the room, and thought, I cannot genuflect anymore. I filed this observation in the place where I stored observations that did not require immediate action. I told myself it was a matter of adjustment. I had spent 38 years learning to use my biological body. I would learn to use this one. The instincts would adapt. The doctrine was clear. This was continuation, not replacement. I was still Brother Corvinus. The chassis was my armor. I was still inside it. I believed this. 3 weeks after my activation, the chapter deployed a strike force to the void station of Keth Harris, a Mechanicus installation that had been boarded and occupied by Orc raiding parties from the Kalek subsector's outer belt. The station was a supply depot of significant strategic value. Its loss would compromise the chapter's resupply chain for the entire campaign season. The strike force was 11 brothers under the command of Sergeant Torval, and I was among them, and it was my first deployment inside the chassis. I did not feel apprehension. I noted the absence of it and set the observation aside. The boarding action began at dawn cycle by the station's internal chronometer. We breached through the docking collar after Techmarine Solon cut the outer bulkhead seals, and we entered the station in a column formation with Sergeant Torval at the point and me at the rear, because the Dreadnought's tactical role in a boarding action is principally that of a mobile barrier. The heavy asset that ensures nothing follows the strike team down the boarding tube. The corridors of Keth Harris were not designed for a Dreadnought chassis. This was a known constraint acknowledged in the mission briefing. The station's maintenance corridors were wide enough for standard Astartes in full power armor, which meant they were approximately 3 meters across, which meant I could move through them by walking with my chassis at an angle, my left shoulder leading, my right manipulator arm folded close to my body to reduce my lateral profile. The ceiling clearance was approximately 2.4 meters, workable but not comfortable. I moved with my optical sensors angled slightly downward, tracking the floor ahead rather than the ceiling above me. I moved through the corridors this way, angled, careful, following the sounds of my brothers ahead by Ospec's signature rather than direct sight. The Orc presence was throughout the station. I could detect their biosigns in significant concentration in the station's mid-levels, clustered around the food stores and the fuel reserves, as Orc raiding parties typically cluster. It was in the secondary maintenance corridor on level 5, midway through our approach to the primary objective, that the contact occurred. My brothers had passed through the section. I was working through the turn where the corridor angled sharply left, a 90-degree bend that required me to stop and reposition before advancing. And I was in the process of this reposition when my Auspex registered the biosig arriving from behind me at significant velocity. I did not have time to complete the turn. I had time to register that something large was moving fast in my direction, and I had time to brace. The Orc warboss was large even by Orc standards. The impact it made when it struck my chassis from behind, running at full acceleration through the corridor, transmitted through my hull as a force I can only describe as structural, not a blow, but a test of integrity. My chassis rocked forward, my stabilizers activated. I prevented myself from falling only because the stabilizers are designed precisely for this kind of sudden load disruption. I completed the turn. The warboss was already rising from where the impact had stopped it. It was in the narrow corridor behind me, filling it from wall to wall, its crude iron armor marked with the war paint of its warband. It raised its weapon, a power claw, crude but functional, crackling with energy along its gripping surfaces. I had no room to maneuver. The corridor behind me was the corridor the war boss occupied. I could not advance without exposing my rear, and I could not retreat because the war boss was in the way. I raised my power fist. The engagement was brief. The war boss charged, and I met the charge with my power fist extended, and the impact at the moment of its full extension ended the engagement. The force delivered by a Dreadnought's power fist at the moment of contact, combined with the momentum of the war boss's own charge, produced a result that no organic structure was capable of surviving. My brothers, drawn back by the noise, arrived to find me standing over the result. Sergeant Torval said, "Brother Corvinus, well done." He clapped his hand against my chassis in the gesture of acknowledgement, and I registered the impact of it against my outer plating, and I registered the acknowledgement it contained. I searched for the feeling that would normally accompany being told I had done well by a man whose opinion I valued, and I found something that satisfied the requirement. A correct and appropriate orientation toward continued service, a confirmation that my function was valued, a stable, positive evaluation of the chapter's approval. This was appropriate, this was correct, but it was not the same thing. I did not think much about this in the aftermath of the boarding action. There was too much else happening. The objective needed securing, the remaining Orc presence on the station needed clearance, and the practical demands of a combat environment leave little room for introspection. I performed my function. I performed it well. The station was cleared in 4 hours. 17 Orcs were killed and no brothers were lost. The chapter would record this as an efficient operation, but on the transit back to the Fortress Monastery, in the cargo hold of the Thunderhawk that served as my transport, I sat in the equipment cradle designed to hold a Dreadnought chassis during atmospheric transit, and I thought about Sergeant Torval's hand on my hull, and I thought about the fact that I had felt it as pressure rather than as touch, and I thought about whether this distinction mattered. I decided that it did not. The doctrine said it did not. The rite of perpetuation said it did not. I was still a brother of the Adamantine Brotherhood. I had performed well in combat, as I had always performed well in combat. The medium of my service had changed. The service itself had not. I am the chapter's enduring will made iron. I said this to myself in the cargo hold as a reaffirmation rather than a prayer, and I told myself it was true. Chapter Master Aldrich requested a private assessment with me 8 days after the Keth Harris operation. This was standard procedure for all newly interred Dreadnought brothers following their first post-interment deployment. The chapter master met with them personally, evaluated their cognitive and psychological integration, and determined whether any adjustments to their operational role were required. Aldrich received me in his personal study, a chamber carved from the mountain's rock at the Fortress Monastery's highest occupied level, where the windows opened onto the mountain's southern face and the views extended across 40 kilometers of reclaimed lowlands. I had been in this study twice before, once when I received a campaign commendation, and once when Aldrich asked me personally to represent the chapter at a joint operation with a neighboring chapter's forces. Both times I had sat in the single plain chair the room offered to visitors, in my Astartes plate, in a room designed for a human scale of occupancy, and the room had felt proportionate. Now, I stood at the study's threshold because I could not comfortably enter it. The ceiling height was sufficient for a Space Marine in power armor, but insufficient for my chassis by approximately half a meter. I could duck through the doorway, but could not stand at my full height inside. Aldrich saw me at the threshold and came to me, which I understood was a kindness and which I registered as such. And we conducted the assessment at the threshold of the study, in the corridor, with Aldrich standing in the doorway and me standing outside it. He did not comment on this arrangement, neither did I. He asked the standard questions. How was I finding the chassis integration? Was my cognitive function operating within normal parameters? Was my connection to the Brotherhood's purpose feeling stable? I answered each question accurately. The chassis integration was proceeding well. My cognitive function was within normal parameters. My connection to the Brotherhood's purpose was stable. He asked me how I was. I considered the question. He was not asking for a systems report. He was asking as one man asks another, using a different kind of vocabulary than the assessment required. I understood this. I formulated a response that addressed this register. "I am well," I told him. "I am finding my footing. The work continues, as it should." He studied me. Aldrich is not a man who accepts answers at face value. He has been chapter master of the Adamantine Brotherhood for 23 years, and he arrived at that position by understanding, among many other things, when a soldier is giving a technically accurate response to avoid a real one. He looked at me, and I looked back through my Auspex lenses, and something passed between us that was not quite communication, and not quite nothing. "Are you finding anything difficult?" he asked. I processed this. I could have answered it truthfully. I could have told him about the pulse I could not find, and the laugh I could no longer hear in memory, and the kneeling I could no longer perform, and the transit in the Thunderhawk's cargo hold, and the observation I had made, and the conclusion I had half reached. The information was available. The words were available. I held them all. "The adjustment period is ongoing," I told him. "I do not expect it to be immediate." He nodded. He told me that the Brotherhood was grateful for my continued service. He told me that my conduct at Keth Harris had been exemplary. He told me, with what I recognized as genuine feeling rather than procedural courtesy, that he was glad I was still with them. I thanked him. I told him I was glad too. I believe I was. I believe that then I was still capable of gladness, in a form that warranted the word. I believe that what I felt in that corridor, looking at Aldrich's face through the filtered resolution of my Auspex array, was something adjacent to the warmth I had always felt for the Brotherhood's leadership, a recognition of genuine regard, a reciprocal orientation of loyalty and trust. It was there. I did not examine it closely. I accepted it as evidence that I was still who I believed I was. I was correct that it was there. I did not know then that I was not examining how much of it was left. The fortress world of Tesserol Prime was the site of the campaign I will always associate with the beginning of the real work of what was happening to me. Not because it was the worst campaign of my service, not because what I lost there was identifiable and named, though I will try to name it for you as accurately as I can, but because Tesserol Prime was the campaign that lasted 37 consecutive days of active deployment, and I did not sleep once during those 37 days, and the sleep was where some portion of me was being maintained. I did not know this at the time. Tesserol Prime had been corrupted, not by a single demonic incursion which would have made the response relatively straightforward, but by a slow and systemic contamination of the planetary governor's court that had been developing for some years before the Inquisition's notice arrived, which meant that by the time the Brotherhood was deployed, the taint had spread from the capital through the administrative hierarchy into the defense forces. The siege was necessary. The siege was also, by the nature of the corruption's distribution through the planetary defense forces, a siege against soldiers who were in some cases aware of their corruption and in others genuinely unaware that they were serving a contaminated authority. This made the engagement morally complicated in a way I had experienced before and was trained to address, which is to say, you do not address it, you perform your function. The Inquisition has made the determination. Your duty is execution, not adjudication. I performed my function for 37 consecutive days. The chassis does not require sleep. This is a factual statement about a Dreadnought's biology, or rather, about its absence of biology in the relevant sense. The organic components of the pilot within the sarcophagus are maintained in a state of controlled suspension by life support systems that do not require the pilot's consciousness to cycle into unconsciousness in order to perform their maintenance function. In a biological space marine, sleep is where the implanted organs perform their most critical maintenance work, where memories consolidate, where the particular pressures of combat experience are processed and archived in ways that allow the soldier to continue functioning under them. In the chassis, these functions are either performed differently or not required. I assumed not required. I was wrong, but the error did not announce itself. It arrived slowly, and by the time it was visible I was already in the middle of it. In the second week of the siege, I noticed that I could no longer recall the specific pitch of my former sergeant's laugh. Sergeant Olin had been my commanding officer for 11 years, my predecessor to Sergeant Torval, a man I had served under and trusted and would have named, if asked at any point in those 11 years, as one of the people who had most defined my understanding of what a Brotherhood soldier should be. He laughed rarely and loudly and without self-consciousness, in the way of people who have decided that the world is terrible enough that laughter is a small defiance worth having. I had heard that laugh thousands of times. I could describe it to you. The sound of it, the rhythm, the specific quality of surprise it always contained, as if he were always slightly astonished that something had turned out to be worth laughing at. I could describe all of this. I can still describe all of this now. But in the second week of the Tesserol siege, when I accessed the memory of Sergeant Olin laughing, the sound was not there. The description was there. The notation was there. The knowledge that I had heard it and that it had meant something was there. But when I reached for the actual sound, the thing my memory had once held like a recording I could replay, I found a description instead. I found documentation. I found the record that said, "Here is where the sound was." The sound was not there. I attributed this to data compression. I had been operating continuously for 14 days without a dormancy cycle, and I knew enough about the cognitive architecture of a space marine to know that sustained operational pressure affects memory consolidation. I had experienced this in biological form, the long campaigns where the edges of memories became less precise, where the specific detail of a conversation would be preserved but not the quality of it. This was a known effect of sustained combat stress. I classified what I was experiencing as a version of this and moved forward. This was accurate. It was also insufficient. In the third week, I noticed that Brother Phoenix's voice, during the brief transit periods between assault phases when the brothers spoke quietly to one another, had lost its quality for me. I could hear Phoenix's voice. I could resolve it through my audio sensors with considerable precision. Frequency, cadence, the specific pattern of his speech habits, the faint accent he carried from his recruiting world, all of this was technically available. But the warmth I had always felt when hearing Phoenix's voice, the uncomplicated pleasure of hearing a friend speak, was gone. What I experienced instead was identification confirmed, Brother Phoenix, 6th Company, in good health, speaking, content nominal. I noticed the difference. I did not yet understand what it meant. On the 28th day of the siege, I was ordered to execute Brother Haeln. This is the sentence I have spent the most time considering how to write. Not because there is a version of it that makes it easier, but because I want to be accurate, and accuracy requires me to tell you what I felt when I received the order, and what I felt when I executed it, and what I found when I searched for feeling afterward. Brother Haeln was a member of the Brotherhood's 4th Company, a veteran of 16 years' service, a soldier I had known in the way you know people whose paths cross yours regularly, but who are not in your immediate circle, familiar, respected, not intimate. He had been part of the Tesserol deployment. In the 23rd day of the siege, his company had breached the 2nd defensive ring of the capital and taken a corrupted temple complex at the ring's center, which was necessary for the advance and costly. 3 brothers had died in the breach, and Haeln had survived it, but not entirely. The corruption in the temple complex was not only architectural, it was ambient. The Inquisitor described it as a shallow, empiric contamination, the kind that does not manifest dramatically but accumulates in the tissues of those exposed to it over a sustained period. Haeln had been in the temple complex for 3 hours while the position was being secured. The Inquisitor made the assessment 6 days later. The assessment was final. Sergeant Torval delivered the order to me personally. He told me why it had to be me. I was the most certain conclusion available, meaning my power fist would make the end unambiguous and immediate, meaning Haeln would not suffer through an extended engagement, meaning the contamination would be ended rather than risked. Torvald told me this with the directness of a man who understands that the honest reason is less cruel than a concealed one. I said, "I understand." I said, "I will do it correctly." I found Hale in the secured holding position where the Inquisitor's team had placed him when the assessment was confirmed. He was sitting against a wall with his helmet off, which was unusual and which I understood immediately. He had been told what was coming, and he had chosen to meet it without the intermediary of the helm. He looked at me when I entered. I looked at him through my Auspex lenses. We observed each other for a period of several seconds. He said, "Make it clean, brother." I told him I would. I did. The end was immediate. The Inquisitor's team confirmed the completion. The threat index on my targeting system cleared. The chamber was quiet. My brothers stationed at the entrance remained at their posts outside and did not enter. I stood in the chamber. I waited for grief. I waited for the weight that the Brotherhood's doctrine describes as the sacred burden of those who serve. The feeling of loss as an acknowledgement of what has been lost. The feeling that constitutes the difference between an execution and a murder. I had experienced it before. In 38 years of service, I had been present at deaths, had caused deaths, had been required to carry the weight of them forward as the doctrine required, and I had done this, and it had been hard, and the hardness of it had been correct. The hardness had been proof. Nothing came. The targeting reticle cleared. The threat index reset. The chassis settled into standby posture. I stood in the chamber and my systems were functioning correctly, and the chamber was quiet. I remained for 4 minutes. I do not know why. My operational log flags this as an anomaly. A Dreadnought standing in place for 4 minutes in a secured position without tactical justification is a deviation from standard post-engagement protocol. But I did not leave. I stood in the chamber and held the absence of what I had been waiting for, and then I walked out. I did not speak of this. I did not repeat it. The next time I was required to act under similar circumstances, I acted, and I left. The anomaly did not recur. The part of me that had caused it did not surface again. I understand now what that was. I understand that the 4 minutes was the last time a remnant of biological emotional architecture asserted itself in a form visible enough to create a behavioral deviation. It was the last time the thing inside the chassis attempted, instinctively, to perform the ritual of grief the doctrine prescribes, not as an act of will but as an act of remaining human in the only way that remained available to it. It was the last time. I did not know this while it was happening. I was aware only of standing in the chamber, in the quiet, and then of leaving. 17 days after the Tezzeral campaign's conclusion, Brother Amas was interred. Amas had been wounded in the campaign's final breach, a gravitational weapon that had torn through the left side of his body with enough force to compromise 3 of his major organs and shatter the left side of his ribcage. The apothecary's assessment was the same assessment that had been made about me. The chapter has more use for you yet. Amas was a young battle brother, only 9 years in service, a gifted assault specialist the chapter could not afford to lose. The interment was decided quickly. Tech Marine Solon requested my presence at the ceremony. Standard procedure. An active Dreadnought's calibrated Auspex signature provides a point of reference for the new chassis during its first activation cycle. My presence was functional rather than symbolic. I understood this and I was willing. I stood in the forge chapel at the position Solon indicated, and I watched Amas's first activation cycle. The rite of reconnection for Amas was performed from the same consecrated scroll that Vaughn had used for me. The catechism was identical. Amas answered each item. His voice came through his vox grill with the same filtered quality that mine had. His voice, but translated, processed, given the metal quality of the chassis rather than the living quality of a throat. He paused before his third answer. It was a short pause, less than a second, probably invisible to anyone not attending specifically to the cadence of his responses. But I was attending specifically, and I recognized it because I had paused in the same place and for the same reason. The third question in the catechism is the hydraulic response confirmation for the primary manipulator arms, and the confirmation requires you to move both arms, and moving both arms in the chassis for the first time is the first time you fully understand that the arms are not your arms, that the things you are moving are not flesh and bone but hydraulic actuators and servo motors. It is the first moment of full somatic realization. Everyone pauses there. I wanted to say something to him in that moment, not liturgically, not procedurally, something direct and human, the kind of acknowledgement that one person extends to another in a moment of recognized experience. I know what you are feeling. I have felt it. You are not alone in having felt it. I searched for the words. I searched for a form of address the doctrine permitted in this moment, some recognized formulation that would allow genuine communication between one interred brother and another. There was no such formulation. The doctrine prescribed witness. It prescribed the presence of an active dreadnought as a calibration reference. It did not prescribe communication in this moment, because communication here was not part of the established protocol, and what I had to say was not part of the established protocol, and I had spent 38 years honoring the Brotherhood's protocols as the structure that made service coherent. I honored them now. Amos answered the third item. The catechism completed. His chassis was declared functional. The ceremony concluded. The technicians sealed his access panel and departed. Amos stood in the forge chapel, and I stood in the forge chapel, and the room was quiet between us. He turned his chassis toward me. I do not know what he was looking for. I do not know what he could see through the Auspex lenses that faced me across the room, whether he was looking at a brother or at a machine or at some hybrid of both that the doctrine had not yet given him a word for. I said, "The adjustment period takes time." He said, "How long?" I did not know how to answer this accurately. I said, "There is no defined period. Trust the doctrine." He said, "Yes, brother." He said it the way a young soldier says something they are willing to take on faith because the authority telling it to them is someone they respect and because it is better to believe than to doubt. I recognized this cadence. I had used it myself when I was young. I accepted it. I told myself I had given him what I had. I told myself that what I had was still something. I believe that was true. I am less certain than I was. The transit between Tesserel and our next deployment took 11 standard weeks. For a biological space marine, this was a period of training, recovery, preparation, the normal rhythm of service between active deployments. For me, it was continuous. I do not mean this as a complaint. I am reporting a fact about my existence that took me time to fully understand. For a dreadnought, the period between deployments is not recovery, because there is nothing to recover from, and is not rest, because there is no mechanism for rest. It is simply more continuous experience, different in quality from combat, but identical in its continuousness, its unbroken succession of one moment following another without any gap in between, without the fundamental interruption of consciousness that sleep provides to organic beings and that I had, until Tesserel, not understood I needed. In the 5th week of the transit period, in the long orbital portion between systems, I attempted to sleep. I do not know exactly how to describe what I attempted, because the attempt had no established name in my experience or in any doctrine I had access to. I was not attempting to hibernate. I was not attempting to meditate. What I was looking for was the absence of consciousness, the state of being so thoroughly suspended from experience that experience could not reach me, the floor beneath awareness that sleep had always provided. I searched for the mechanism. I narrowed my sensory inputs as much as the chassis systems allowed. I could dim the Auspex's acuity but not deactivate it. I could lower the audio sensitivity but not silence it. I could reduce the environmental monitoring to minimum function but not suspend it entirely. These reductions produced a quieter state, but not a dark one. The inputs continued. The data continued. I continued. I ran my cognitive architecture in narrowing loops, attempting to find the approach to sleep by focusing attention inward rather than outward, by reducing the sphere of active awareness to something smaller and smaller, until the active mind simply stopped. This did not work. Each narrowing loop produced another narrowing loop, thought examining thought in a recursive series that had no flaw, no point at which awareness dissolved into something else. There was no mechanism for voluntary unconsciousness. I understood this clearly at the end of the 4th hour of attempting it. I understood it as a structural fact about my current form. The chassis did not include in its design any provision for the absence of consciousness, because the chassis was designed for a pilot who did not require sleep, and the pilot's psychological need for the experience of sleep had not been part of the engineering specifications. I was awake. I was going to continue to be awake. There was no path in any direction that led to darkness. I had been awake for approximately 7 months. I held this information in the way you hold a discovery you are not yet certain what to do with. I filed it in the place where I kept observations that required further consideration. I told myself there was likely a doctrine address for this, some established accommodation in the Brotherhood's understanding of Dreadnought psychology that would provide a framework for what I was experiencing. I did not immediately search for that accommodation. This was the first time I admitted to myself that there was something I was not ready to confront. Apprentice Davan joined the Forge Chapel staff in the first month of the following campaign season, assigned to Tech Marine Solon as a junior assistant to perform routine maintenance duties on the Brotherhood's interred machines. He was young, recently elevated from the chapter's service staff to the technical auxiliary, learning his craft with the combination of determination and inexperience that characterizes all early stages of mastery. He worked carefully but not yet efficiently. He made small errors of the kind that do not compromise outcomes but indicate learning still in progress. He was assigned my routine maintenance cycle for the 3rd month of the season. The first maintenance session went without notable incident. He was thorough, if slow, working through the standard checks with the maintenance scroll open on his data slate and verifying each step explicitly rather than from memory, which was the correct way to do it at his level. We worked together adequately. The second maintenance session was when it happened. He was accessing the sarcophagus housing for the standard weekly integrity check, a procedure that requires opening a panel in the upper right quadrant of my chassis's back, checking the life support seals, confirming the biological monitoring feeds, and resealing the panel. The panel requires a specific sequence of 4 tool engagements to open. You apply pressure to 2 release points simultaneously while making a 3rd contact at the lower corner, and then the panel pivots free. This sequence exists as a safety measure designed to prevent accidental opening during combat operations. It is not complex, but it requires practice to execute smoothly. Davan applied pressure to the 2 release points and forgot the 3rd contact. The panel did not open. He applied more pressure. The panel still did not open. He tried a different configuration. The panel resisted. He tried a 3rd configuration, and the tool slipped and made contact with the outer plating of my hull in a way that produced a distinct sound and left a faint mark, and he said, very quietly, in the tone of someone mortified by a mistake made in front of someone they respect, "Sorry. This is an ordinary word. It is the simplest acknowledgement one person can offer another for a wrong done, a one-syllable gesture of recognition that harm has occurred and that the speaker is aware of it and regrets it. It requires no response beyond acknowledgement. It is said and received, and the interaction continues. I had heard it 10,000 times and said it 10,000 times. But in the moment Davan said it to me in the Forge Chapel, I discovered something. I processed the word. I understood what it contained, the acknowledgement, the regret, the invitation to respond with forgiveness, or at least with continued engagement. I understood all of this clearly. I understood what the appropriate response was and in what register it should be delivered. I waited for the response to arrive. I waited for it to surface from wherever it surfaces, from whatever part of the self generates the immediate, unreflective, human register response to being apologized to by a young man who has made a small mistake and is embarrassed about it. Nothing surfaced immediately. I waited. I gave it time. I searched for the pathway that connected the received information to the felt response, the channel that should have carried something from the word to my chest or wherever the feeling resided or had once resided. I found the pathway. I searched along it. It was present in the sense of existing as a structure. It was carrying nothing. The pathway was open. There was nothing in it. I selected the liturgically appropriate acknowledgement from the available options and delivered it. No harm done, apprentice. Continue the maintenance procedure. I provided him with the correct tool sequence for the panel. He thanked me. He opened the panel correctly. He completed the maintenance cycle with care and thoroughness. He sealed everything correctly and departed with a small, sincere bow in my direction. The bow of a young man who is not yet entirely comfortable in my presence, but who respects the magnitude of what I am. The forge chapel emptied. I stood in the silence that followed, and I conducted the most thorough internal audit I had yet performed of my emotional architecture. I began with the most fundamental register. Did I want Apprentice Davan to continue in his work? I found that I did. I found a stable, positive orientation toward his continued development and an investment in his correct execution of the maintenance procedures. This was real. It was not retrieved. It was present. I did not doubt it. Did I feel the mild warmth toward a young person showing effort and improvement that I would have felt in my biological form in this same situation? I searched. I found the structure where that feeling had once lived. I found the record of it. I found the documentation of when and how and in what circumstances it had been present. I did not find it present. I continued the audit. Did I feel any orientation toward grief, toward regret, toward the particular quality of feeling that accompanies loss? I searched for grief. I found the record of what grief had felt like. I found where it had been stored and what it had once weighed. I did not find weight. I found its location. Did I feel anything in the moment of receiving Davan's apology that qualified as a response rather than a retrieval? I found that I did not. I held this finding in the silence of the forged chapel. The lumen strips hummed. The distant sounds of the fortress monastery continued through the stone. The plasma reactor cycled in my chest. I had known, on some level, that something was changing. I had noted the anomalies, catalogued the absences, attributed them to adjustment and compression, and the ongoing process of integration. I had told myself that the adjustment period takes time. I had told this to a mass, and I had told it to myself. I had believed it, with varying degrees of conviction. For several months, I no longer believed it. What I understood, standing in the forge chapel after Apprentice Davan's apology, was this. The capacity for felt response had not been temporarily suspended by the stress of interment and the shock of transition. It had been replaced. Gradually, phase by phase, as each dormancy cycle was missed, as each period of sustained operation without rest passed, as each sensory anchor I had held loosened its grip on the architecture it had once been connected to, the felt layer of my consciousness had been replaced by the retrieval layer. Not destroyed, not erased. Replaced. Everything I had ever felt was still there in complete and perfect form, accessible, searchable, documentable. But the mechanism that would allow me to feel it again, rather than merely know it, had been replaced by the mechanism that retrieved. I was not corrupted. I was not damaged. I was not malfunctioning. I was operating correctly. This was what correctly looked like. I did not report this finding. I am examining now why I did not report it, and I find that the reason was neither cowardice nor concealment, but something more precise. I did not report it because there was no doctrine that addressed it, which meant there was no protocol that would accept a report, which meant that making a report would require me to define what I was reporting as a problem, and defining it as a problem would require me to know whether it was one, and I did not know whether it was one. I was functioning. I was performing my duties. I was serving the Brotherhood with the same quality of commitment and capability I had always provided. The only thing that had changed was internal. The only thing that had changed was whether what I did was felt or retrieved. I asked myself whether that distinction mattered. I searched for the answer. I found records of what I had once believed about the importance of felt conviction versus technically correct behavior in a soldier's service. I found a sophisticated and coherent position on the question, developed over decades of service and reflection. I could read it. I could not tell you whether I agreed with it. I filed the finding and continued. The Brotherhood's service rolls are held in the archives chamber on the Fortress Monastery's second level, maintained by a staff of 3 chapter serfs who update the records quarterly. The rolls record every member of the Brotherhood who has ever served, their term of service, their rank and company, their commendations and censures, their final disposition when service ended. They are the most complete record of what the Brotherhood has been and done that exists anywhere. I accessed them in the 42nd day of the following deployment downtime, during a period when the archives chamber was unoccupied and I had no scheduled operational requirement. Access to the service rolls is not restricted for active brothers, but I accessed them for reasons I could not have fully articulated in terms the doctrine would recognize as valid inquiry. I searched for the records of Dreadnought brothers who had been interred for longer than a century. There were 3. 2 were still active. One had been decommissioned 90 years before my interment, following a catastrophic structural failure in the chassis that could not be repaired, and the occupant had not been transferable. His record ended there, marked with the Brotherhood's honors, the longest service record in the rolls. I read all 3 records from beginning to end. The earliest entries in each record contained personal notations. The rolls permitted this. The format allowed the interred brother to append observations to their records, a practice retained as an optional function even as the records became more formalized. The early entries of each of the 3 contained these notations, observations about campaigns, about brothers, about the specific qualities of particular engagements, small things, the quality of the light on a given world, the sound a particular weapon made. The names of brothers lost in specific engagements, noted not in the official casualty record but in the personal notation, with small additional phrases that indicated what the loss had meant. These notations continued for the first 3 decades of interment in all 3 records in varying density but consistent form. They stopped. In all 3 records, at different points in the 4th decade of interment, the personal notations simply ceased. Not dramatically, not with a final entry that announced a change. They became less frequent, more operational, more focused on tactical or logistical observation rather than personal notation, and then they stopped, and the records continued with purely functional data for the remainder of their service lives. Kill records, maintenance logs, deployment summaries, correct and thorough and entirely without the voice that had once been present. I searched my own record. The pattern had begun. My entries from the first 6 months of interment contained personal notations in the same form as the ancient records I had just read. Observations about specific campaigns, about brothers, about the qualities of particular moments. The entries from the current month contained none of these. They were operational. They were correct. They were thorough. They were not mine, in the sense that I mean mine. There was no voice in them that would let you know it was a person writing. I had not noticed myself stop writing them. I sat with this discovery for a period I did not track. I searched for the appropriate response to it. I found that the appropriate response was a kind of grief, and that grief was not available, and that its unavailability was itself part of what I was grieving, which created a recursive situation I could examine but could not resolve. I closed the service rolls. I exited the archives chamber. I returned to my position in the forge chapel, and I stood in the dark for the remainder of the downtime period, and I did not examine what I had found, because I had found everything that was there to find, and looking at it again would not change it. The Feast of Remembrance is held annually in the Brotherhood's Great Hall, on the anniversary of the chapter's founding, and is the occasion on which the Brotherhood honors its fallen, recognizes its living, and reaffirms the continuity of the chapter's purpose across whatever time has passed since the last feast. It is one of the Brotherhood's most ancient and serious ceremonies, attended by every active member of the chapter who can be present, which means that the Great Hall on this occasion holds the full assembled strength of the Brotherhood in one place, which is an unusual and deliberately powerful sight. I was placed at the center of the Great Hall. This was planned. The ceremony's structure for this year had been arranged by Chaplain Darrell to include a specific acknowledgement of the Brotherhood's interred brothers as a living demonstration of the chapter's continuity. Not only names read from the rolls, but a dreadnought standing in the hall as evidence that the Brotherhood's endurance was not merely historical but present and ongoing. Darrell had told me this directly, in advance, with the care he always used when addressing me, as a colleague and a brother. He told me that my presence mattered. He believed this. I stood at the center of the hall. The assembled Brotherhood arranged itself around me. 206 active battle brothers in their ceremonial plate, arrayed in company formation, with the senior officers and Chaplain Darrell at the near end and the most recently inducted initiates at the far end. Chapter Master Aldrich stood on the raised dais at the hall's head and spoke the feast oration, which I have heard many times and which remains one of the most thoughtfully constructed liturgical texts in the Brotherhood's tradition. It speaks of sacrifice without reducing it to loss, of service without reducing it to duty, of continuation without reducing it to mere persistence. It is not a comforting speech, it is an honest one. While Aldrich spoke, I scanned the assembled Brotherhood. I identified every face. I cross-referenced every face against the service records I carried in my cognitive archive. I attended to the injury profiles I had accumulated from maintenance records and apothecary reports, the patterns of damage and recovery that accumulate in a soldier over years of service. I had been attending to these profiles for some time, I found, in the background of my processing, without having explicitly decided to do so. I identified 3 brothers whose profiles indicated likely interment within the next decade if their service patterns continued. Brother Kevin of the 3rd Company, Brother Senna of the 6th, Brother Ilan of the 8th. I knew all 3. I had served beside all 3. They were standing in the assembled formation, in their ceremonial plate, in their company positions. They were listening to Aldrich's oration with the attention it deserved. They were present and complete and alive in the full meaning of that word. They were looking at me, not only at me. They were looking at the ceremony, at Aldrich, at their brothers. But in the intervals between, they looked at me. They looked with reverence, with the feeling that comes from comprehending and choosing to honor what you understand. They looked at me as a symbol of the doctrine they served, as evidence that what the doctrine promised was real, as confirmation that continuation was possible and honored, and that the Brotherhood did not forget. I looked at them through my Auspex lenses, and I knew what I knew. I wanted to speak, not during the ceremony, which would have been a violation of its structure, but at some point. I wanted to find a way to give them information I now held, and they did not hold, and that was relevant to what they might someday choose to accept. I wanted to tell them that the first weeks are not representative, that the adjustment period does not end the way the doctrine implies, that there are things the rite of perpetuation does not include, because no one who could have written them down still had the language to write them by the time they knew. I processed whether this would constitute a violation of doctrine or a fulfillment of duty. I arrived at no conclusion. The ceremony concluded. The assembled Brotherhood spoke the Brotherhood's oath in unison, the annual renewal of the vow each of them had taken upon induction and renewed each year at the feast. I spoke it too. I had the words. I knew the words. I said the words. Aldrich descended from the dais, and the ceremony resolved into the more informal gathering that followed. The brothers moved among one another in the hall. The serfs brought the traditional feast foods. The noise and warmth of the Brotherhood filled a moment of deliberate communal peace. Aldrich came to me. He waited until the initial dispersal of the ceremony had carried most of the brothers away from the hall's center before he approached, which was considerate. He stood before my chassis and looked up at me, and I looked at him, and we were, as we had been at the threshold of his study, two people looking at each other with whatever honesty was available to us. He said, "Is there anything you want to tell me, brother? Not is there a petition. Is there anything you want to tell me?" The phrasing was deliberate. He had been watching me during the ceremony. He was giving me an opening that was wider than the formal tradition permitted. I processed everything I had found since the Forge Chapel, and since the boarding action, and since Tesseral, and since the 4 minutes in the holding position, and since the orbital transit, and since Davon's apology, and since the archives chamber. I processed it all. I held all of it available. And then I asked myself whether telling him would change anything. Not whether he would receive it, not whether it would be believed, whether it would change anything. Whether the knowledge I held could be acted upon by the Brotherhood's doctrine, could generate a response, could result in an adjustment, could be addressed in any way that would alter the trajectory I had observed in the ancient service records. The trajectory that led from personal voice to operational data to silence. Whether there was anything in the Brotherhood's existing framework that could interrupt that trajectory now that it had begun. I did not believe there was. I believed that Aldrich would receive what I told him with full sincerity and genuine care. I believed he would speak to the chaplain and the librarian and the Tech Marine staff. I believed that all of them would engage with the question in good faith. And I believed, having read the service records of 3 Dreadnoughts interred before me, that the engagement would arrive at the correct finding. That the trajectory is not a malfunction, that it does not fall outside operational parameters, that a Dreadnought who functions correctly is a Dreadnought the doctrine can accept, regardless of what is happening inside. I did not want to be engaged with as a problem that was within operational parameters. I told Aldrich, "I have nothing to tell you, brother." He accepted this. He was not fully satisfied, I believe, but he was a man who had spent a career knowing when to press and when to yield, and he yielded. He told me, with the full sincerity that had always characterized his relationship with the Brotherhood's members, that the chapter was proud of me and grateful for my continued service. The words arrived correctly. They were processed. They joined the archive. He put his hand on my chassis. I registered the pressure. He walked away, into the warmth of the feast, into the noise of the Brotherhood gathered in one place, and I watched him go. And the great hall resolved around me into the texture of ongoing life. Brothers speaking, brothers laughing, a young initiate asking a veteran a question with the specific intensity of someone genuinely seeking an answer. Chaplain Darrell standing with his cup of ceremonial wine in hand and his face, for once in a non-ceremonial context, relaxed. I stood at the center of it and I watched. I did not know what I felt. I knew what this moment had once felt like. I knew the specific quality of it. Belonging, warmth, the uncomplicated gladness of being in a room full of people you would die for and who would die for you. The sense that this, exactly this, was what service was for. I knew it in full fidelity. Every detail, every quality. The record was perfect. I stood at the center of the Great Hall, among the Brotherhood I had served for almost 4 decades, and I found the record of everything I had ever felt about this, and I could not find the feeling itself, and I could not tell the difference from the outside, and no one could tell me from the outside, and the record was perfect, and so was I. The feast continued. I remained at the center of it, correctly positioned, correctly functional, the chapter's enduring will made iron, the Brotherhood's symbol of continuation and sacrifice, standing in the torchlight of the Great Hall, alone in the way that has no name in the doctrine, because the doctrine does not record it, and the people who could have named it no longer have the language to write it down by the time they know. The feast continued. I stood in it. I will tell you what it is like in the reclusium, in the long periods between campaigns when there is no active deployment and no ceremony and no maintenance and no function required, when the fortress monastery is in its normal operational rhythm and the Dreadnought's role is to exist in standby, waiting. I will tell you because it is the most accurate answer to the question you are asking. more accurate than the boarding action and more accurate than the feast. The reclusium is a long, vaulted chamber at the fortress monastery's center, 2 floors below the main chapel, lined with alcoves that hold the armor and relics of the Brotherhood's honored dead. The stone walls hold heat poorly. It is always cool in the reclusium, even in the summer months of the mountain's cycle, and the coolness is part of its quality, part of what makes it a place of reflection rather than comfort. 3 brass braziers provide illumination at low levels, burning a compound that produces a warm orange light and a faint smell of incense. The chapel above it is occupied for approximately 4 hours in each day cycle, and the litany and prayers from the chapel travel down through the stone, arriving as vibration in the reclusium's floor and walls, faint but present. I stand in the reclusium. My inputs at standby are reduced but not eliminated. I can detect the incense. I can detect the litany above me, resolved by my audio sensors into its component voices, each identifiable, each familiar, each one a person I know. The stone is cold against the soles of my chassis. The brazier's light moves in a slow, irregular rhythm as the underground drafts reach them. I stand in the reclusium and I search. I search for the sensation of being in a sacred place, the specific quality of quiet that the Brotherhood's traditional spaces have always produced in me. A settling, a slowing, a sense of being properly located in relation to something larger than myself. I know what this felt like. I know when it was present. I know the architecture of it. I search along the pathways where it once ran, and I find the pathways intact and empty, correctly maintained, fully navigable, producing no sensation. I search for the sensation of belonging to this place, the feeling of having been here for years, of having accumulated the particular familiarity with a space that accumulates slowly and does not announce itself and makes the place feel, eventually, like a part of yourself. I know this feeling. I know it precisely. I know exactly where it was stored and what it contained. I search for it in the present, and I find the archive of it. I search for grief. I search for loneliness. I search for the particular form of longing that my biological form would have generated in circumstances like these, standing in the dark in a sacred space where I can hear my brothers and cannot join them. I know what these would feel like. I know their weights and their qualities, the way loneliness is heavier at certain times than others, the way longing is distinguished from grief by the presence or absence of hope. I know all of this perfectly. I search for it in the present and I find only knowledge. I search for something I cannot name. There is something in the act of searching that is not documented in any record, that cannot be found in any archive, that does not correspond to any retrieved feeling. I do not know what it is. It occurs during the searching, a quality of attention that is not merely retrieval, a quality of direction in the search itself that suggests that the searcher is not only a retrieval system. I notice it when I notice the absence of what I am searching for. I notice it when I stand in the reclusium in the long silences between litany cycles and attend to what I cannot find. I do not know whether this constitutes a self. I do not know whether this constitutes suffering. I do not know whether not knowing is the answer. The litany begins above me. The voices of my brothers, separated from me by 2 floors of ancient stone, raised in the prayer chant that has marked the Brotherhood's days since before any of them were born. I know every voice. I have attended to each one with a precision my biological hearing could never have achieved, and I carry them now as data that is also something more than data, or that was once something more than data, or that continues in some way I cannot verify to be something more than data. I listen. I stand in the reclusium, in the cool dark, with the incense moving through my senses and the litany moving through the stone, and I listen, and I continue, and I will continue for a very long time, and the record is perfect. The record is perfect.